All right, so welcome Mastermind. Tonight's webinar is on releasing intergenerational fear and opening to new possibilities. And this is part of the Optimism Code because there is such a strong link between fear that is unprocessed and our sense of optimism and safety and enthusiasm in life. All right, so let's make a start. All right, so the place that I want to get started is by talking a bit about intergenerational trauma. Okay, so this is the trauma that gets passed down from generation to generation when it's not healed, it's not processed at the level of the individual that experienced the trauma. Then messages about life get passed down to the children of those parents. So, for example, if trauma is unprocessed by a parent or a caregiver, then their schemas about life, about safety, about relationships and health will likely be passed down to the next generation through the messages that the parents give to the child, behaviors, and also modeling. So when trauma isn't processed by the individual who experienced the trauma in their own personal life, it often gets stored in the body, in memories, and therefore in behaviors, in personality traits, and it gets passed on to the next generation and so on until somebody processes the trauma or the fear. And this way we can stop this sort of intergenerational passing down of trauma. Okay, so trauma doesn't only get passed down through environmental factors such as what the parent says or does, or the messages, or the way that they raise the child, but it can also be transmitted through the process of epigenetics. And this is a really fascinating area that I feel in the field of mental health that we want to be paying a lot more attention to in the future to understand not only the negative impact of epigenetics, but how it can be turned around for the positive. All right, so the term epigenetics means above the genes. Okay, so in simple terms, this is the best way I can describe it. We have our DNA, but then our DNA can be coded with extra information attached to it on top of it, like a layer on top, with extra information about survival that gets passed down to the next generation. And in that would be instructions about how to survive, how to behave, or how to respond under certain stressful conditions. And obviously that's important information to be passing down to your offspring if it contains important information about the types of things that can threaten our livelihoods. Okay, so what that means is that under certain conditions, through the process of epigenetics, gene expression can be activated without changing the DNA itself. So something can be expressed in the body, even though the DNA remains the same, the behavior is adapting to the additional environmental stressors. So let me give you an example. Let's say a man was a soldier in World War II, went off to war, experienced just total devastation and hardship and trauma. And let's also say that the mother was the wife of this soldier who came home with untreated PTSD, and he had all of this rage and anger and problems with alcohol, say, for example. Now, the DNA of their child that they have together will be coded with this additional information about how to respond under stress. So, for example, that child's DNA could involve, personality traits like being highly agreeable or highly conscientious or whatever. They're all normal personality traits. But let's say that his DNA is also coded with extra information because what's being handed down from the parents. And that extra information is something like messages that emotional expression is dangerous and suppressing emotions is important for survival. So then we may find that this couple have a son who really suppresses his emotions because it's in his genetic coding that it's unsafe to be emotionally expressed, that will threaten his survival. And that may even be if the parents don't directly give that message to not express emotions, but it's also at the level of the DNA. So that's an example of how this process works. Okay, so if we have parents or grandparents or ancestors who have experienced negative events such as war or poverty, enslavement, abuse, neglect, sexual assault, homelessness, long-term unemployment, abandonment, etc., these are all very traumatic to the individual. Then a certain degree of fear obviously is also passed down through both epigenetics and the direct or indirect messages that are communicated in the early family environment. Messages about whether you can trust women, whether you can trust men, whether money doesn't grow on trees, and all those sayings, back in the 70s. I can't think of any at the moment. Rachel's really good at these, but money doesn't grow on trees is a good example. These cliches that may have applied for our parents or our grandparents, but it doesn't take into account the new conditions of the life that we may be in now. Okay, so it's very important to understand if our own fears have a historical origin that doesn't even incorporate our own personal histories. Okay, but the good news is that in the right environment, the gene expression can also be altered or deactivated, and new neural pathways can create a different epigenetic coding process. Okay, so in the same way that it can work in the negative, where we develop, trauma-based responses, schema-based responses to adapt to negative environments. In the same way, we can cultivate new, more healthy environments and conditions so that those messages that are attached to our DNA are not needed to be activated. Those negative conditions would lay dormant and not be expressed. All right, so by creating more nurturing and safe environments that are optimal for growth and love in life, we can heal the traumas that our ancestors were unable to heal due to some of the historical, social, and intellectual barriers that we are less impacted by than they were. All right, so this process of healing and creating these safe, nurturing, optimal environments really highlights the importance of therapy and why therapy works and why we do it. But also equally important are the roles, of healthy, intimate relationships, the environment that you cultivate with a partner is also very healing because it's providing perhaps that safe environment, that safety and that structure that maybe previous generations didn't get to enjoy in their own intimate relationships, say our parents or our grandparents or our great-grandparents. So that really shows how this process can be healed when someone in the family line says, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to create a safe environment, a nurturing environment, so that at least I can flourish. And then it's more likely that, our children, if we have children, are going to flourish but also our communities as well. Like, even if you don't have children, that, the people around you will witness this way of living and start to adapt to that and model that as well. So important. Okay. So, yeah, so it's not just therapy, it's also our intimate relationships, our close friendships. If we say, no, I want to have friendships with people that I can trust and that make me feel safe, but also safe work environments. I want to work in an environment where I feel valued and I have a voice, and my efforts and gifts are rewarded and appreciated. And of course, our own inner healthy adult. That's the number one source of this new healthy optimal environment, is this inner healthy adult part of us that says, I'll create safety for you. I'll create safe conditions for your life. Okay, so that is what leads to the healing, because that changes the course of history, if you like, as opposed to repeating patterns that we witnessed in our childhood growing up without consciously examining, the source of our fear responses. All right. So why doesn't this change more often? I believe it's because, this process of epigenetics often remains unconscious because family trauma is often not spoken about. So when the parents or the caregivers haven't healed their own wounds, then they're not in a position where they can teach their children, or maybe not when they're a child, but as they become older, like adolescents in their 20s, that would be a good time for a parent to teach the child some of the lessons of their own traumas, so that the child can take that wisdom with them into life. But so often that's not the case, because so many people haven't done healing, haven't done the therapy, so they still have, such a sense of shame about what they went through, because they probably have internalized that and blame themselves, or think that there's something wrong with them because they experienced that trauma. But also they're probably overwhelmed because they don't have the inner resources to on their own to unpack such deep-rooted emotional pain. So often intergenerational trauma is just passed down by default, because it's not being discussed, it's not being integrated into the family story, so that the children are then left to figure it out for themselves, as they enter adulthood and they realize that they've got all these patterns that don't make sense, and they want to understand why they are so cautious in certain situations. Okay. So mostly by the time we reach adulthood, we may have some sense of the trauma that our parents, grandparents, or ancestors went through. We start to piece everything together, across a couple of decades. We kind of have taken little bits of information and pieced it all together, and constructed some kind of story or reality about what it appears has gone on in our parents' or grandparents' lives, but not in a coherent narrative way. So often it's not told as a story, by that parent or caregiver to the child, so that they can really sort of make sense of that story, learn from it, and change. Okay. So I think that's important to realize, is that, yeah, a lot of us have a sense of maybe what our parents, grandparents have been through in their lives, but not often in a coherent way. And that realization often comes later in life, which means that as far as the inner child is concerned, the inner child in us hasn't been brought up to date with the new understanding, with the new perspective. So through the eyes of our inner child, they're still in fear. They're still holding all of these messages of fear and harm and threat, and everything hasn't been all integrated into one. Okay, so in other words, the inner child has not been brought up to date with how their life trajectory is actually different to their forebears. In the inner child's mind, it's like they're on the same path and they should expect the same kind of threats to happen in life. All right. This is starting to make a lot of sense and tie lots of things together, and especially explain why so many people struggle with optimism, and also why so many people have developed pessimism as a protective layer, because pessimism is sort of a protective layer that could protect from potential harm or threat, sort of like an insurance policy. If I'm pessimistic, then I'm more likely to focus on things going wrong and less likely to be harmed that way. But you can see how this is a massive problem if the cause of your pessimism is unprocessed trauma from previous generations. Okay, now I'm going to get really high tech just for a moment, and hopefully this diagram, this graph, is going to help you get a visual understanding of why some people experience this sort of sense of abundance and optimism and infinite possibilities in life, and why other people experience more pessimism. Okay, so this is basically developed by Dr. Dan Siegel, a psychiatrist from the States, highly intelligent, intellectual man. And sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around, you know, when he delivers training. However, I think he's on the money. So he has come up with this graph of individual humans' subjective experience in life, and explaining why some people are more triggered and have more of these peaks of activation, which are basically triggers, and what is required to become less triggered in life and to have access to more possibilities, more explanations, more narratives that are likely to result in more positive outcomes. Okay, so if you look at this graph, and I've just added a few things to it. Okay, so at the top here, these spiky bits are like a trigger. So let's just say someone has a fight with their spouse, and they become so triggered that the degree of probability of them thinking that the relationship is over, you know, there's no hope, all of that, is more likely the higher up this scale of what he calls plateaus of probability. Okay, so these plateaus here, you know, these steps, these big steps that bring us higher and higher up towards the trigger, are what I would describe as these vulnerability factors, like schemas. If you have schemas such as an abandonment schema or a mistrust abuse schema or a punitiveness schema, that's going to push you higher up this plateau. If you have certain modes like a controller mode or a compliance surrenderer mode, that's going to push you higher up this plateau. You're coming from this base of, you know, all of these conditions priming you towards a certain reaction. You know, your personality traits, your genes, your epigenetics, all of that contribute to how much of a plateau you're on that would take you closer and closer towards some kind of triggering response, which is to believe that this relationship is over, I can't trust anyone, etc. That's a very narrow experience. You know, do you know what I mean? Like, it's a very narrow experience to go to the same place every time something ambiguous happens, to reach the conclusion that the relationship is over and I know they've cheated on me. It's just a very narrow conclusion to be drawing, when actually there's a whole range of explanations that could be possible in this moment, but you don't have access to them because of these schemas and modes that push you higher up the scale. Right. However, down here at the bottom is what Dan Siegel calls the baseline of infinite possibilities, which I just love that term. Like, even learning this from him, and all I need to do is say to myself, okay, if I was down on the baseline of infinite possibilities right now, what are some other explanations for this problem that I'm in, this stressful situation that I'm in? And automatically I have access to different outlooks, different perspectives, different narratives, and getting away from these conditions that prime me for a certain emotional response. Okay, so down here on the baseline of infinite possibilities, you have access to an infinite number of responses because you don't have any preconceived ideas about what the cause of this problem is. Okay, so down here on this baseline of infinite possibilities, you find the healthy adult mode, the side of us that's wise and can take in all of the data, and all of the possibilities, and use our mind, but use our emotions and use our values and be guided by many, many different forces. Okay. Down here also is where the happy child in us hangs out. The happy child mode, part of our psyche, is open to new possibilities and fun and adventure and exploration and novelty. Okay, it's open, it's not closed and rigid like a vulnerable child would be, or an angry child, but a happy child is sort of feels safe and fun and is more open to things going well, just assuming and trusting that things are going well in life. Okay, so therefore has access to far more choices and opportunities than if we were up here on one of these plateaus. Okay, down here is where we find our intentions for life. Down here is where we can find our core values in life. Down here is where our hopes and dreams hang out, not up on these plateaus. The higher up we go, the more rigid we become, the more narrow we become in our outlook on life. Yeah. Down here on the baseline is the new solutions. So for example, the person who may have an abandonment schema on this plateau, and every time there's some ambiguity in their relationship, and they're used to being triggered and assuming the worst and assuming that the relationship is over, if we can help them to come down here onto the baseline of infinite possibilities, we know that the healing pathway for the abandonment instability schema is security and stability. So we would say, okay, just get in touch with this more secure and stable side of you. And what would that side of you say about this situation? And from that place, this more healthy, balanced side would say, oh, maybe that isn't what's going on. And, I can trust this partner, even though previous partners, even though my dad cheated on my mum or my mum cheated on my dad, that's not the case for me. And we can differentiate and have access to more possibilities than if we are being driven by schemas. Okay, so I just find this complex but fascinating and very powerful to say, okay, the influence of our previous generations, of our parents, caregivers, grandparents, great-grandparents, do influence the degree to which we are sitting on these plateaus, just waiting for some kind of situation of uncertainty or stress And then we're more likely to respond in the ways that are in line with previous trauma and those messages, then we are likely to respond from a place of newness and freshness and open to new information. All right, so I hope that visually helps. Okay, so what I would like to do is what I do in all of these webinars is to guide you through an imagery now. Okay, so before I get started on this imagery, you know, it is designed to bring up strong feelings. So if that feels overwhelming, then you know, I won't be upset if you turn it off or leave it or whatever. But if you've done some degree of processing of, you know, your family lineage and you have a sense of what's happened in the history in your family, then this will be fine. Okay, so as always, I'm going to switch my video off so that we can not be distracted, and we will make a start. Okay. Okay, so to begin this imagery, I invite you to close your eyes and take a few slow, deep breaths. And imagine you are standing on top of a mountain. And when you turn around to look behind you, you see all of your ancestors that came before you. You see your parents or caregivers, the people who had the most direct impact on your early childhood environment. And from this perspective, you can also see the suffering that they experienced in their own lifetime. You look behind them and you see two sets of grandparents. Maybe these grandparents you had a close relationship with, or maybe you didn't. Or maybe they were no longer alive by the time you entered the world. Take a moment to reflect on the hardships that they may have personally experienced in their own lives. Then see all of your aunts and uncles who are part of your lineage and standing next to your grandparents. Now see your great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents and all of your ancestors back through the centuries, all lined up behind you. And see yourself here on top of this mountain, fully supported by life itself, being filled up with courage, optimism, and new possibilities for your life ahead of you. Now, as you prepare to speak to your forebears, perhaps you could choose one family member that you feel comfortable to address in this healing dialogue. Someone who perhaps you have carried their unhealed trauma with you into your adult life, that you are now ready to release. Imagine they are in front of you and you have a sense of peace as you start to speak. And they are also at peace and ready to hear what you have to say. Now start by greeting them. Say, hello, mum, dad, grandfather, grandmother. I can see the hardships and the great suffering that you experienced in your own lifetime, and also the suffering that your parents also endured. I am so sorry that you experienced such suffering and trauma. I am here to do my best to release this suffering from our family lineage. I will do my best to create a life where I enjoy peace in my home, peace in my relationships, peace at work, and peace in my community. I will do my best to release myself from any intergenerational fear of abandonment and betrayal, any fear of the future, any fear of scarcity or poverty, any fear of harm, catastrophe, and illness, and fear of life itself that does not belong to me. I will do my best to cultivate a greater capacity to trust my nearest and dearest. I will do my best to create security and stability in my home life. I will do my best to embrace hopefulness and enthusiasm for life and the future. And I will do my best to practice faith in the goodness of life. I want to go forwards into life and explore the infinite possibilities that are available to me in this lifetime and open my arms wide to abundance, peace, joy, and love. Now just pause for a moment. Take a moment to witness their response and allow whatever response to come up that feels true for them. And to close the dialogue, say thank you for the opportunity that you gave me to be alive and for the role that they've played in your life. For some, this may be just providing you with the biological aspect of birth. For others, they may have contributed significantly and profoundly to your development and given you many, many opportunities that you are eternally grateful for. Say whatever feels right and true. Now it's time to turn back around and look out over the valley of your life in front of you. Notice the feeling in your body as you release the intergenerational fear from your cells that is no longer needed in your lifetime. Notice the feeling of lightness, of excitement, and of wonder that comes upon you as you experience this sense of infinite possibilities for your life from now on. What adventures will you go on? What new patterns and habits will you cultivate in your relationships? What new choices will you make that is best for your life? And just take one last moment to capture this feeling in your body of releasing intergenerational fear and embracing the new possibilities that lie ahead for you. And slowly, when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Okay. All right. This is such a powerful imagery that I feel so many people need to include in their healing journey, because it's so powerful to tie it all together and to have that wider, bigger perspective where we can, really have an understanding of the history of some of our fears and habits and patterns. And I know for myself, this has really helped me in my own healing journey to understand the influence that trauma has in our family lineage, and being able to reflect on what are some of the habits or beliefs or behaviors that I may have adopted that I'm more free to release now, that don't necessarily serve me, and they don't serve my children if my children are growing up in a very different environment, which of course is it's a privilege, obviously, to live at a time in life where we have so much better conditions, perhaps than our parents did or our grandparents did. And I truly believe deep down that our parents, our grandparents, our ancestors want us to experience that freedom and that joy that they weren't able to. Deep down, I believe that that is what they would want for us, in the same way that we want that for our future generations. If you have children who may have children one day and you may become a grandparent one day, don't you want them to, experience more joy, more abundance than maybe we even got to experience in our lifetimes? Hopefully, yes. That's the direction that we want in life to go in. All right, so I've just got an embodiment practice that I invite you to do for the rest of this week as we wrap up the optimism code. Is start your day with a sense of wonder or an appreciation. So wonder is this sort of, I guess it's a mental activity, which is, oh, I wonder what today will bring, and being open to new experiences and good experiences happening to you. And I just love the word wonder. I use it a lot. I wonder, or I wonder, how good could it get? That is the language of that baseline of infinite possibilities. Oh, I wonder what might happen. It puts you in that more right side of your brain, the imagination. Okay. Or so practicing awe, which is like in this picture here on the screen, these two people just looking out at the stars and the sunset and just being in awe of the beauty that is around us in this life. And then appreciation, which is really that receiving, that sort of letting all of this sort of come in and sort of fill you up, and being open to receiving all of this abundance and all of the gifts that are around you and appreciating it. So, for example, on my morning walk where I go through the swamps and along the beach and the creek, I'm experiencing a lot of this sort of awe and appreciation of this environment that's surrounding me. So hopefully everyone has their own little examples of things that they, that fill them up and give them that sense of appreciation. All right, so that is the end of the webinar. So I'm going to stop the recording here.